wall of the polling booth. How electoral psychology enlightens democratic citizenship. Michael Bruter, London School of Economics and Political Science.
When the Berlin Wall came down, I was 14, attending a young Europeans gathering. We dreamt of solidarity in Europe when someone switched on the TV. The images were surreal.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to have been invited by the organizers of the Falling Walls conference as one of the social scientists who, together with you, is going to break the wall of the polling booth, or at the very least, in a slightly more environmentally friendly way, take a peek through the curtain. The results I'm presenting to you today are the results of the ICRAP initiative, which is the world's only initiative solely dedicated to understanding what goes on in the mind of voters. And it is supported by a European Research Council grant called Inside the Mind of a Voter. And what we are doing for the current 5 years is that we try to understand what is the power of emotions, personality, memory on the way people vote. Why do we do it? We do it because, as we found out from one of our recent surveys, 29% of Americans and 40% of French people tell us that they've already changed their mind on how to vote on the very day of an election. In fact, if you think of the recent presidential election, which took place on Tuesday, 25%, 1 in 4 voters, either changed their mind or made up their minds between the 1st of November and the day of the election itself. So what we are trying to do is understand what's happening, what is there about the atmosphere of elections, about the specific context of the election, which triggers some psychological reactions which are such that people do not end up voting in the way they were actually predicting. There is one thing I'm not going to talk to you about today, which is the impact of personality on the vote. And I'm not going to talk to you about it because it's just too long and too complicated. But so that you know, in addition to exploring the impact of a certain number of personality traits, such as aversion to risk or self-confidence on the way people vote, we've got a number of things which are actually a little bit unusual about the research, such as associating people's favorite color, or the animal they would compare themselves to, or how they would rank the 10 Commandments, or the 7 deadly sins, and the way they vote. So that's the part which I'm not going to talk to you about. Instead, I'm going to focus on the impact of memory, emotion, personality on the one hand, and secondly, the way they interact with the electoral system design to trigger some specific reactions. In terms of the methodology, the project is extremely ambitious. We conduct it in over 15 countries already. We include some panel study mass surveys, which mean that we re-interview the same people, thousands of people, over several years. We conduct some in-depth interviews. We conduct some spot interviews where we ask people to tell us in just one sentence what went through your mind when you were in the polling booth. We recruit some people to keep some election diary for a full month. They will actually record all their thoughts, all the discussion about the election. And in addition to all these ways of people telling us about how they feel, we actually partner with election observers who can actually tell us, in the day of a polling station, how do people dress when they go to vote? How many come on their own? How many come with children? Do they look worried? Do they look excited? What sort of questions do they ask? And finally, we conduct a number of experiments, one of which took place today, which actually enable us to characterize a certain number of psychological mechanisms which lead people to whatever they do. One of the important elements that we use is that we've got a model of electoral identity, which we continue to prove test after test, which shows that voters are really made of 2 different types of people. If you think of an election as a sort of competition between alternative parties or candidates, some people behave like referees who actually arbitrate between the different people and the different offers that they can judge. And some people behave like supporters. And supporters and referees are almost equally shared, but they will have very different types of emotions which are triggered at the time when they actually participate. And if I can now ask the people up there to actually show the first clip, we are going to start talking about emotions. And as we talk about emotions, we are going to show you footage, maybe, from the experiment which took place today, thanks to some of you, in which people were actually asked to vote using 3 of the most common types of ballot, either paper or electronic types of ballots, and were actually filmed through the curtain so that, without being able to recognize them, we are able to identify, if you want, a certain number of reactions. Now, you will recognize the person. This first clip is actually made with actors. The second one you'll see a little bit later is made of real voters who didn't know what was taking place. What are the emotions that people feel when they are in the polling booth? There are 4 main types of emotions. The first one is excitement. 79% of people tell us that they feel that voting is important to them, and 60% that they're actually excited when they vote. The second major emotion is pride. 74% of voters feel proud when they're in the polling booth. The third, which is very much related with excitement, is being worried. 53% of voters tell us that when they vote, they are actually worried. And when you actually think of this mixture of emotions, this mixture of pride, excitement, and worry, and you think about the different ways in which they can be combined, what you actually find is a certain setup which is going to recall some memories which we have accumulated over the course of our lifetime, but which suddenly, even though we didn't think that we had them at the back of our mind, will make people behave in specific ways. Now, what elections do people remember? People remember elections going back all the way to their childhood. 70% of voters actually remember one of their childhood elections, for instance, going to the polling station with their parents. And 82% of American voters remember the first time they voted. In terms of what people remember, and that's perhaps even more important, even though people do remember things such as who won the election, how they voted themselves, the main memories which actually have an impact on the way people vote are memories of either discussions or arguments that we have. And when you actually look at these things together, I'm presenting you a memory cloud which is made of the open-ended long interviews on electoral memory we conducted with American people. And what you can immediately see is that some of the things which actually have a tremendous presence in people's minds are references to their family, school, first, as in the first election. And these are the type of things that people actually associate with elections at the time when they go to vote. Now, to move on from there, there is the question of what happens with which is going to trigger, if you want, the specific emotions, the specific personality trait, which I didn't tell you about, and the specific memories to result in some specific aspects of voting behavior. And what is really important here is to introduce the concept of what I call electoral ergonomy. Now, if you think of ergonomy, the ergonomic design of a pen, for instance, many people think that it means designing a pen in such a way that it's easy to handle, considering the shape of the human hand. But that's not really the case. When people design an ergonomic pen, they design a pen which is easy to handle by the human hand, considering its function, which is to write. And what is missing very much in the current debate on electoral design is that people actually say, well, we should introduce e-voting, for instance, or we should introduce postal voting, because this is what corresponds to the way in which people live. What is missing is a reflection on the function of elections. And what happens is that even though there is, if you want, a systemic function of election, which is to allow people to appoint their representatives, there is also a democratic, representative function of election. And that's the function which consists of giving people the impression that they actually matter in a democracy, organizing a very unique moment of civic communion between voters and their political systems. And in order to actually understand the role of electoral ergonomy on the way people vote, we conducted this number of experiments which I told you about. And if you want to show the second clip, we'll actually be able to relate to some of the things which I mentioned. The first element, and that's something which we tested today, is that the way in which you organize elections will have an influence on the amount of time people spend thinking about the way they vote. Again, as I mentioned, we had 3 different types of ballot, 1 electronic and 2 paper ballots. On average, the people who voted using the electronic ballot spent 20 seconds in the polling booth. The people who used the French type of ballot, when you've got different types or different names on individual pieces of paper, spent 1 full minute in the polling booth, 3 times longer. Think about all the things that can actually happen in their minds when they spend these extra 40 seconds in the polling booth. The second aspect is that voting doesn't only affect the time people spend thinking about how they vote, it also affects who they vote for. One of the field experiments which we conducted during the UK general elections in 2010 is that we compared the way in which people voted depending on whether they went to the polling station and the polling booth, which is the traditional way of voting, or whether they used postal ballots. The nice thing with our panel study design is that we can control for everything, including the way in which people intended to vote 3 weeks before the election, their demographic and sociological background. When you control for all these things, the people who actually used postal ballots were 25% more likely to vote for an extremist party than people who went to the polling station. This means that there is something about the atmosphere of the polling station which makes people behave in a different way, which makes people think about their vote and take a sense of responsibility, which is actually of tantamount importance. In terms of the e-voting experiments which we conducted this time in labs, we found that not only do people who vote remotely from home are more likely to vote for extremist party, but they also feel less efficacious. They feel that they don't really matter in the democracy, and they are less satisfied with democracy, which means that ultimately they feel more cynical, and if they feel more cynical, they are also less likely to participate in elections in the future. Which means that the main reason why you would want to introduce e-voting, supposedly because it will increase the level of turnout, is in fact counterproductive over time, because the people who actually use this method of voting end up feeling that it doesn't actually serve any purpose. Now, to conclude, I actually want to go back to the notion of breaking the wall of emotion, if you want, in the polling booth. And I want to be serious again for a second. What is really important about the moment when people are in the polling station and in the polling booth is that the level of emotion, the level of anxiety is heightened in such a way that they are in a very specific predisposition to relate to others and relate to their political systems in a way which they do not experience in their everyday life. The people who actually vote in the polling station vote in a way which is significantly more sociotropic than the people who vote from home using postal voting or electronic voting, which means that when they vote, they don't actually think of what is good for them, but of actually what is good for the society. And when you actually look at that and think of it in terms of the opportunity it gives political systems to reconcile themselves with voters who are increasingly cynical, increasingly dissatisfied with the organization of politics, you think that there is something to do to put together the conditions of reconciliation between voters and the political system. And I'll leave you with one final thought, one final finding, which is that 50% of the people whom we interviewed told us that one of the main emotions they feel when they are in the polling booth, which is something that people never feel when they vote electronically or postally, is that they feel happy. Thank you very much.